Something unexpected happened when your name came up in a conversation your soulmate never thought would involve you, and their reaction may have revealed far more than they intended. Someone from their past mentioned your name casually, perhaps without realizing the emotional history connected to it. But the moment your soulmate heard it, something inside them shifted. For a brief moment, the conversation around them seemed to disappear. They may have gone quiet, looked away, changed their expression, or suddenly become much more attentive than they had been seconds earlier. They tried to act normal because they didn't want anyone noticing how deeply those few words affected them. But there was something about hearing your name from someone who knew another chapter of their life that made the memory feel unusually real again. They weren't prepared for the emotions that surfaced. They may have believed they had already placed this connection somewhere safely in the past, but your name brought something back that they had worked hard not to examine. And now they are left wondering why a simple mention of you could still create such a strong reaction. What they don't realize yet is that their attempt to hide that reaction may have revealed the very feeling they have been trying hardest to keep private. The moment passed, but your soulmate couldn't simply move past it. They may have continued the conversation as though nothing unusual had happened, yet internally they were no longer fully present. Hearing your name had created a distraction they couldn't easily control. They were suddenly aware of every emotion they had tried to place somewhere in the past, and now those emotions were quietly asking to be acknowledged. Perhaps they changed the subject quickly or responded with a casual comment, hoping nobody would notice the difference in their behavior. Maybe they even smiled and acted as though your name meant nothing special. But inside, they were doing something completely different. They were replaying the moment they heard it and wondering why their first reaction had been so immediate. They may have been asking themselves why their heart reacted before their mind had time to prepare an explanation. That is what made the situation uncomfortable. If your name truly meant nothing anymore, they should have been able to hear it and continue without a second thought. Instead, their minds suddenly traveled backward. They remembered conversations, expressions, small details, and moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt strangely alive again. And because the person who mentioned your name came from their past, the experience may have felt even more powerful. It was as though two different chapters of their life had unexpectedly collided in the same conversation. The person they once were, the memories they carried, and the connection they thought they had already understood were suddenly standing in front of them at the same time. They may have wondered whether this person knew something they didn't, whether your name had come up before, or whether there was some reason it appeared at that exact moment. But the more they tried to analyze the circumstances, the more they realized that the real issue wasn't who mentioned your name. It was what hearing it awakened inside them. Their reaction may have been subtle, but emotionally it was significant. They could feel themselves becoming more guarded because they didn't want anyone to see how quickly their thoughts had shifted toward you. They may have looked away, become quieter, or started choosing their words more carefully. Perhaps they even tried to convince themselves that the reaction was nothing more than nostalgia. After all, people remember people from their past. A familiar name can naturally bring back old memories. But something about this felt different because the memory wasn't simply pleasant or neutral. It carried unfinished emotion. It brought back a question they had never fully answered. They began wondering whether they had actually moved on or whether they had simply become better at avoiding the subject. There is a difference between forgetting someone and learning how to live without talking about them. Your soulmate may now be realizing that they never truly forgot. They simply stopped giving the memories a voice. They stopped asking why certain moments still mattered. They stopped wondering what might have happened if certain choices had been different. They told themselves that enough time had passed and that the connection belonged somewhere in the past. But hearing your name disrupted that belief. Suddenly, the emotional distance they had created didn't feel quite as permanent as they thought. They may have remembered the reasons they pulled away, the things they never said, and the moments when they wished they could go back and respond differently. The conversation around them continued, but internally they were somewhere else entirely. They were trying to understand why one simple name could reopen an entire emotional chapter. And perhaps what made them most uncomfortable was realizing that they couldn't completely control what their reaction revealed. Words can be carefully chosen. Explanations can be prepared. People can say they have moved on and genuinely believe it. But an unexpected emotional reaction can sometimes expose a part of the heart that has not caught up with the story the mind has been telling. Your soulmate may not have been ready to admit what that reaction meant, but they could feel that something important had surfaced. And from that moment forward, they could no longer hear your name in quite the same way. The more your soulmate tried to act unaffected, the more difficult it became to ignore what that moment had awakened inside them. Once the conversation moved on, they may have expected the feeling to disappear with it, but instead, your name stayed in their thoughts. They began remembering details they had not consciously thought about in a long time. Particular conversation came back, a certain look. A moment when the two of you seemed to understand each other without needing many words. They may even remember something you said that they once dismissed, but now see differently. This is where the reaction becomes more than simple nostalgia, because they are not just remembering you. They are remembering how they felt when you were part of their life. And those two things are very different. A person can remember someone without feeling emotionally connected to the memory. But your soulmate is beginning to realize that your name still carries an emotional response they cannot completely explain. They may start questioning whether they ever truly processed what happened between you, or whether they simply buried the complicated parts and continued with life. Perhaps they told themselves that the timing was wrong, that circumstances made the connection impossible, or that distance had naturally taken care of everything. But now they are beginning to see that those explanations never completely answered the deeper question. Why did you remain so difficult to forget? Why could one unexpected mention of your name still make them pause? Why did certain memories remain unusually vivid even after so much time had passed? These questions begin opening a door they thought they had permanently closed. They may find themselves thinking about the version of you they knew and wondering whether they ever really understood you. Perhaps there were things you felt but never expressed, things they noticed but never questioned, or moments when both of you were protecting yourselves instead of speaking honestly. Your soulmate may begin recognizing that the connection wasn't necessarily difficult because there were no feelings. It may have been difficult because there were feelings neither of you fully knew how to handle. That realization can be powerful because it changes the meaning of the silence, the distance, and even the moments that seemed like rejection. They may wonder whether they interpreted your actions through their own fears instead of seeing what you were actually trying to communicate. And as those thoughts continue, another feeling begins to surface: regret. Not necessarily regret over everything that happened, but regret over what remained unsaid. They may wonder what would have happened if they had been more honest, more patient, or less afraid of vulnerability. They may remember opportunities when they could have reached out but chose not to because they didn't want to appear too invested. They may think about moments when they wanted reassurance but instead acted distant. Looking back now, those choices may seem different because they are no longer trying to protect themselves from the possibility of caring. They are finally admitting that they did care, and that admission can feel surprisingly difficult. Your soulmate may have spent a long time believing that hiding their feelings gave them control, but hearing your name unexpectedly showed them that buried emotions don't always disappear. Sometimes they simply wait for the right memory to bring them back to the surface. This is why the reaction mattered. It wasn't necessarily proof of what will happen next, and it doesn't automatically mean they are ready to return. It revealed something much more personal. Your connection still occupies a meaningful place in their emotional memory. They may not know exactly what to do with that realization yet, but they can no longer pretend it isn't there. The person who mentioned your name may have moved on from the conversation without realizing what they triggered, but your soulmate is still carrying the emotional aftermath. They are beginning to understand that your name represents more than a person from the past. It represents a chapter that shaped them, a connection that challenged them, and feelings they never completely learned how to name. And now they are standing in front of those feelings again, wondering whether the thing they tried so hard to hide was never that they remembered you, but that a part of them still cared what happened to you, and this is where the hidden feeling becomes impossible for your soulmate to dismiss. Because the reaction they tried to hide has now forced them to confront something they have spent a long time avoiding. They may have wanted to believe that hearing your name simply brought back an old memory, nothing more. But the longer they sit with what happened, the harder that explanation becomes to accept. They begin realizing that their reaction was not only about remembering you, it was about everything they still associate with you. The emotions, the unanswered questions, the moments they never explained, and perhaps the part of themselves they were when you were in their life. Your name suddenly became a doorway into all of it. And now they are asking themselves why they worked so hard to convince everyone, including themselves, that they were completely unaffected. Maybe they were afraid of looking vulnerable. Maybe they didn't want anyone to know that the connection still mattered. Maybe admitting it would have forced them to reconsider choices they had already made. Whatever the reason, they now understand that hiding a feeling doesn't necessarily make the feeling disappear. It simply pushes it somewhere deeper. The person from their past may have noticed the change in their expression or the sudden silence, even if they didn't say anything. That possibility alone can make your soulmate even more aware of what they revealed. They may replay the conversation later and wonder whether their reaction was obvious. Did they hesitate too long? Did their voice change? Did they suddenly look somewhere else? Did the other person notice that your name meant more than they expected? These small details can stay in their mind because they know they were trying to hide something. And what they were hiding may not have been a simple desire to reconnect. It may have been something more complicated. They still care about how you are doing. They still wonder what you think of them. And they still carry a quiet curiosity about what might have happened if circumstances had been different. That realization can create an emotional conflict, when part of them may want to protect the life they have built and leave the past untouched. Another part wants to understand why your name still has the power to reach them. They may begin wondering whether they ever gave themselves permission to fully acknowledge what they felt. Perhaps they labeled the connection as complicated because admitting that it mattered was too difficult. Perhaps they convinced themselves that distance was the same as closure. But now they are beginning to see that closure isn't always created by separation. Sometimes you can be far away from someone and still carry an unresolved emotional story. This does not mean they are guaranteed to return or that the connection must have a particular future. It means they are finally being honest about the emotional impact you had on them. And that honesty can change the way they remember everything. Instead of only focusing on what went wrong, they may begin appreciating what was genuine. Instead of asking why things didn't happen differently, they may begin understanding what the connection taught them. They may recognize that you challenge them to feel more deeply, communicate more honestly, or confront parts of themselves they usually kept protected. Suddenly, your name no longer represents only the past. It represents a lesson they still carry. That may be the feeling they tried hardest to hide, not simply that they miss you, but that they never became completely indifferent to what you meant. They may have hidden that truth because it felt safer to say they had moved on. But the moment your name was spoken unexpectedly, their carefully maintained distance cracked for just long enough to reveal something real. Now they cannot unknow what they have discovered about themselves. They know that your memory still matters. They know that the connection left an imprint. And perhaps most importantly, they know that their heart reacted before their mind could prepare the answer. That realization may leave them quieter than before, because sometimes the most powerful emotional discoveries are the ones a person makes without anyone else having to explain them. And now your soulmate is left with a realization they can no longer easily push away. Hearing your name did not simply remind them of someone from their past. It reminded them of a part of themselves they had been trying to keep hidden. They may have spent months or even years telling themselves that the connection belonged to another chapter, that enough time had passed, and that whatever they once felt had naturally disappeared. But that unexpected moment showed them something different. The feeling may have become quieter, but quiet does not always mean gone. Sometimes an emotion becomes so deeply buried that a person mistakes its silence for its absence. Your name brought that hidden part of their emotional world back to the surface, and now they are beginning to understand why their reaction was so immediate. They may not know exactly what they want to do next, and they don't necessarily have a perfect answer about the future, but they know they can no longer honestly tell themselves that you meant nothing. That is the part they may find hardest to accept. They could have continued believing that they had completely moved forward if your name had never appeared again. They could have kept the memories organized in a place where they didn't have to examine them. But hearing your name unexpectedly disrupted that sense of certainty. It reminded them that there are still emotions attached to the story, and those emotions deserve to be understood rather than immediately dismissed. Perhaps they begin thinking about whether they owe themselves an honest acknowledgement of what happened. Not necessarily a dramatic confession, not necessarily an immediate attempt to reconnect, but simply the courage to admit that the connection affected them. They may realize that pretending not to care was never the same as actually becoming indifferent. They may also begin understanding that some of their previous decisions were influenced by fear, timing, pride, or uncertainty. Maybe they walked away because they didn't know how to handle the depth of what they felt. Maybe they remained silent because speaking honestly seemed too risky. Maybe they convinced themselves that distance would make everything easier. Now looking back, they can see that the heart does not always follow the timeline the mind creates. You can decide to move forward and still have something unfinished inside you. You can accept that a relationship didn't work in the way you hoped and still acknowledge that the person mattered. You can care about someone without knowing whether your paths will cross again. This is the mature realization your soulmate may now be approaching. Their reaction doesn't have to become a prediction about the future to be meaningful. It can simply become evidence of an emotional truth they had been avoiding. They still have questions. They still have memories. And perhaps there is still a part of them that wonders what your life looks like now, whether you ever think about them, and whether you remember the connection with the same emotional weight. Those questions may not disappear overnight, but instead of running from them, they may finally allow themselves to sit with them. They may even start to recognize that the person who mentioned your name accidentally gave them something they didn't know they needed: a mirror. For a brief moment, their own reaction showed them what their words had been hiding. They saw that the connection still mattered to them in some way, and that realization can be strangely freeing. Because once you stop pretending that a feeling doesn't exist, you can finally decide what to do with it responsibly. You can choose to communicate honestly if the circumstances are right. You can choose to leave the past where it belongs while still honoring what it taught you. Or you can simply carry the understanding forward and become more honest in future relationships. Whatever happens next, the most important change has already occurred inside your soulmate. They no longer have to wonder why your name affected them so strongly. They have begun to understand that the reaction came from a place they had never completely closed. And perhaps the most emotional part of this entire story is that you didn't have to say anything. You didn't have to appear in front of them. You didn't have to send a message or remind them of yourself. Someone simply spoke your name, and their own heart responded before they could organize a different answer. That doesn't guarantee what the future will bring, But it does reveal something worth acknowledging. Some connections leave an imprint that time can quiet, but not necessarily erase. Your soulmate may now look at that truth differently. Instead of being afraid of what the feeling means, they may finally become curious about it. Instead of hiding from the memory, they may learn from it. And instead of pretending that they never cared, they may finally give themselves permission to admit that they did. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive through a confession. Sometimes it appears in a single expression, a sudden silence, or an unexpected reaction when someone says the name you thought they had forgotten. And perhaps that is what happened here. Your name was spoken. Their guard slipped for a moment, and the feeling they had tried so carefully to hide revealed itself without needing a single explanation.